For the last 2 weeks, we've been studying the parable of the unjust steward, which parable I won't read in its entirety again today, but by way of quick summary, in Luke 16, starting in verse 1, Jesus told his disciples the parable of a master who had a steward who took care of his books and kept track of all of his accounts. But this steward was dishonest. He wasn't taking good care of his master's property. Rather, he was being careless with his stewardship. And the implication of what Jesus says there in verse 1 of Luke 16, when he describes the behavior of the steward as wasteful, is that he was squandering his master's goods. He was living a life of dissipation at his master's expense. So his master decided to fire him. Only he gave him some notice. Now, we don't know how much notice the master gave him, but he gave him some. And he instructed him to use the time that he had remaining to get the books in order. Well, quite apparently, this steward knew his master well enough to know that that door was closing on him. We don't know how many chances the steward had gotten before this to clean up his act, but we do know that as he perceived the matter, he wasn't going to get any more. His master was through with him. That bridge had been burnt. That ship had sailed. So the steward decided that he would take this moment that his master had given him to set the books straight and use it to his own advantage. And knowing that he would soon be in the job market, he figured that the best way to find himself a new job as the steward of another man's household would be to use a form of bribery. So he calls his master's debtors in one by one and reduces their account balances right off the top. And he does so, Jesus tells us, with the specific aim in view that when his master lets him go, one of his debtors will give him a new job, or in the words of the steward, that they will welcome him into their homes, which welcome, we presume, is not as a guest, but as an employee or as a steward over their goods, over their property. Now, as I mentioned last week, one would think that that wouldn't be a very good job hunting strategy, because the deals that this steward makes with his potential employers bewray him as a scapegrace. They bewray him as a dishonest steward, as an unjust steward, because the discounts he gives to his master's debtors are coming out of his master's accounts receivable. Or to put a finer point on it, he's cheating his master. He's stealing from his boss. That's why this parable is called the parable of the unjust steward, because the steward is unjust. He's dishonest. And one would think that quality in him would be patently obvious to the people that he sees as his potential employers, and would turn them off from the prospect of hiring him, from the prospect of welcoming him into their homes. But the steward doesn't think so, and neither does his master. Because according to this parable, as Jesus tells it, the master praised the dishonest steward for having the presence of mind to act as he did. And that, according to Jesus, shouldn't surprise us, because as he tells us in verse 8 of Luke 16, the children of this world are more astute in dealing with their own kind than are the children of light. That is, the people that he's trying to woo know what they'll be getting if they invite this scapegrace to come and work in their homes, to be the steward over their goods. But they're willing to take the risk anyway, because they think that they're more clever than he is. So they don't think that he'll get the drop on them. But in the meantime, they can put his wiles to use for their own gain. I have a friend who used to be in the car business in Wichita. He used to go to the weekly auto auctions, which are basically for dealers only. And he told me that one time they rolled out a car out in this auction. It was 20 or 30 years old, but it had a beautiful paint job on it. The interior still needed a little work, and not everything under the hood was in perfect condition, but the body was beautiful. This car looked great. And consequently, The car did well in the auction and went for more than the average car of that make and model would have normally gone for. And when they drove it out of the auction house, the guy who bought it went outside to have a buddy of his snap a picture of him standing next to the car. And when he posed for the picture and leaned on the rear fender, his hand went right through the body. Well, he nearly hurt himself falling over, but once he regained his composure, he started tearing into that fender and discovered that there was nothing there. Whoever had done the bodywork on that car had built that fender out of Venetian blind slats and duct tape and Bondo. But it looked perfect. Now, at these auctions, the rule of thumb is caveat emptor. Buyer beware. So this buyer knew that he had no recourse. He was going to have to eat that car. But after the auction, everyone was trying to figure out where the car had come from and who had done the bodywork. And you know why? Well, it wasn't because they wanted to get even. No, they wanted to know who had made that piece of junk car look so good so they could hire him. They wanted him to do their body work. They wanted him to work on their cars, and so they could put them on the lot, because they knew that this guy was a real artist, that he could make a lemon look like a peach any day. And that was a skill that they valued, and which they gladly would have accessed if they could have been able to find a way to use it to their own advantage. You see, Jesus knows what he's talking about. The children of this world are more astute in dealing with their own kind than are the children of light. And that is an attribute that Jesus sees value in. Now, that may sound a little off. It may sound wonky to you, because it could sound like that what Jesus is doing here is affirming the master for affirming the dishonest behavior of the steward. But that's not really what he's doing. Not really at all. Jesus affirms neither the master nor the steward in this story. What Jesus does do in verse 8, though, is to make an observation. And the observation that he makes doesn't have any moral content to it at all. He doesn't say the children of darkness are more astute when it comes to dealing with their own kind than are the children of light, and that's good. No. The sense of what he says is the children of darkness are more astute at dealing with their own kind than are the children of light, and that gives them an advantage in their sphere, on their turf, in their arena, on their home court. The thing is that in that statement, Jesus makes an implicit distinction between the children of this world and the children of light, because the word that Jesus uses to distinguish between the two groups is the word geneia, which is the Greek word from which we get the word genus. And they both mean the same thing: species, race, kind. And that's important to bear in mind here, because what Jesus is saying is that the monikers he's using here, the children of this world and the children of light, aren't just nicknames. They're not just monikers. That is to say, these aren't just colorful names. They're anthropological descriptions, empirical descriptions. The distinction that Jesus draws between the children of this world and the children of light isn't just behavioral, it's ontological. That is, it goes to their very beings, not just to who they are culturally and behaviorally, but more to the heart of the matter, what they are as creatures. And what Jesus tells us when he distinguishes between the children of this world and the children of light is that that isn't an artificial distinction. According to Jesus, these are different kinds of creatures. They're different genus from one another. And the children of this world are more astute at dealing with their own genus than are the children of light. See, in John 3, 1 through 21, we have John's report of the late night meeting between Jesus and Nicodemus. Now we're all familiar with the second part of this discourse that contains John 3:16 in it. There's the first part of this passage, verses 1 through 8, that are most relevant for today's lesson, and they read as follows. Now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. Jesus replied, Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he has been born again. How can someone be born when they're old? Nicodemus asked. Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb and be born. Jesus answered, Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he is born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it's going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Now, you've heard this text read, and you've read it yourself many times. And most times, what we get out of this text is something having to do with baptism. But don't misunderstand the text and don't misunderstand me. I don't want to discount that. I'm firmly persuaded that as salvation is presented to us in the New Testament, baptism can be distinguished from it, but it cannot be separated from it. Every time baptism is presented in the New Testament in association with salvation, baptism appears to be both normative of and integral to the transaction of salvation. But that isn't what's under consideration in John 3. What's in view in this passage is not the mode of salvation, but the effect of it. Because in this late night meeting, Nicodemus comes to Jesus as a representative of the Pharisees and says, Rabbi, we know who you are and where you come from. And Jesus replies, Nicodemus, you don't know squat. Because only those who are born of the Spirit can properly understand spiritual things, and you, sir, have not been born of the Spirit. No, you have been born only of water. Because in the Gospel of John, water in this context doesn't refer to baptism. In the Gospel of John, water, when it's used in apposition to the Spirit, refers to natural childbirth. That's the origin of the phrase, blood is thicker than water. Because the meaning of that phrase is just the opposite of what most people think it is. Blood is thicker than water means that the blood of the covenant is more binding than the water of the womb. And if you want to hear more about that, go back and listen to lessons number 17 through 20 in the Life of Christ series, The Origin of Species, That Whosoever Faiths in Him, Doing the Truth, and Because They're Goats. The point for today's lesson is, when Nicodemus came to Jesus in the night in John 3 and said, Rabbi, we know who you are and where you come from, Jesus calls him out on it and says, Nicodemus, you know no more about me and where I come from than you know about the wind and where it comes from. Now, here in the 21st century, we know quite a little bit about the wind. More than most of the scientists of Jesus' day did. We understand high pressure systems and low pressure systems and how they affect one another, and the various perturbations of the atmosphere in the earth and on the earth and in the oceans and in outer space that affect the direction and temperature and velocity of the wind. But we still can't do anything about it. To this day, the best we can do when we know that the wind is going to blow is take shelter from it. Well, Nicodemus did not know anything about the wind. He did not know where it came from. He did not know where it was going. And what Jesus tells him in John 3, 1 through 8 is, Nicodemus, you think you know who I am and where I come from, but you know about as much about me as the children and about the children of the Spirit as you know about the wind. That's the meaning of, so it is with everyone born of the Spirit. It isn't that those who are born of the Spirit are just as ignorant about spiritual things as those who have merely been born of water. No, what Christ is saying is that the children of the Spirit are just as much of an enigma to Nicodemus as Jesus is, because he doesn't understand either of them any better than he understands the wind. He hears the words that Jesus is saying, but he doesn't know where they come from. He doesn't know where they're going. That is, he doesn't know what they mean, and he doesn't understand their purpose. And he isn't likely to understand any of the children of the Spirit any better than he understands Christ. And why is that? Well, because he isn't one of them. I don't know how many of you know any twins or grew up around any twins. The twins make an interesting study. See, there was once a time in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and 80s when if you talked about the way people grow up and you talk to any social scientists and ask them, what's the stronger force in determining how a child will turn out when they grow up, nature or nurture? That almost every one of them would have told you to a person that nurture was much stronger than nature. But over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a big shift in the social sciences. And now the majority opinion is that nature plays a much greater role than modern psychology ever predicted that it should play in determining how a child will turn out. That is, people are what and who they are largely from the time they're born. And the jury's still out on the degree to which nurture can actually affect nature. And one of the things that has brought that idea about is twin studies. Because what they have found is that twins separated at birth and raised in different households retain their nature to a much higher degree than social scientists predicted that they would. And they're affected by their nurturing to a much lower degree than predicted. That is, even though they were separated at birth and raised in separate homes with completely different values and customs, they continued not just to look alike, but to think alike, and to act alike, and to have the same attitudes, to like the same foods, to respond the same way to authority, to share the same opinions about things, to get their hair cut the same way, to choose the same kinds of clothing, to marry the same kinds of people, and even to vote the same way, even if they were raised in politically active households of opposite points of view. Because when it comes to acquiring all these proclivities, it seems to be the case that what nature brings to the table is at least every bit as strong as what nurture brings to the table. And it appears that there's a bond of nature shared by twins that simply cannot be penetrated or broken by nurture, even when those twins are separated at birth and grow up in completely different cultures. But when they're raised together, there's something else that occurs, another phenomenon that takes place, and that is that twins very often develop a private language that they speak only to one another before they learn to speak the language of the other people around them. Now, the language developed between twins is often called twin talk or twin speech, but the $10 words for these languages are idioglossia, which means self-language, or cryptophagia, which means secret speech. Now, this is not something that is newly discovered. Twins have been sharing private languages with one another for thousands of years, and it has always fascinated people. But it's difficult to study because most twins abandon their private languages as they begin to speak the language of their culture. And they usually, when they become adults, don't remember their private language well enough to communicate it to others or to explain its vocabulary, syntax, and grammar later on in life. But one of the people who attempted to study this phenomenon was Adolf Hitler, who referred to this phenomenon as Zweilingessprache. Now, Hitler and his scientists, medical experts, they had filled his head with all kinds of ideas. And one of those ideas was that the secret language of twins was not learned, but inborn, and that as such, it ought to be universal. So, if they could gather enough pairs of twins together into one nursery and allow them to converse freely with one another and then listened in on their conversations, they could learn the language. Which language they wanted to learn, because as they reasoned it out, that would be the language. That would be the original language of Earth, which was spoken by all people before the Tower of Babel. That is, they could learn the language of God, or what Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians 13:1 as the tongue of angels, which knowledge, as they reasoned out the matter, would give them power. Now, this experiment, as it turns out, didn't work out for a couple of reasons. First, because as part of the experiment, the nursery where the twins were housed was supposed to be kept completely silent, apart from whatever sounds the children made. That is, the nurses taking care of them were to feed them, change them, hold them, rock them, care for them, and see to their needs, but they were never to speak to them. They were never to utter a sound to them. And under those conditions, the majority of these children simply died. They turned their faces to the wall and died. But for the ones who lived, it turned out that their private languages were, in fact, completely private. That is, there is no universal language that twins are born knowing and speaking to one another and then later forget. Now, this is something that those scientists could have known without conducting the experiment if they had simply read their Bibles more carefully. Now, I know that that's a ridiculous premise. The very idea that Nazi physicians conducting medical experiments on children without informed consent might somehow have benefited if they had simply been more careful in their daily Bible reading. Because clearly, those among them who were reading their Bibles were reading them only with exploitative purposes in mind. I recently heard a story about W.C. Fields, who toward the end of his life, when he was nearing death, was several times discovered in his private bungalow in Los Encinas Sanitarium reading the Bible. And when asked why, because he was not a man of faith, he answered, "Looking for loopholes." People are often motivated to read the Bible for exploitative purposes. But anyone who actually read the Bible looking for clues on discovering the language should easily have been able to discover that the whole idea that people are born full of knowledge and wisdom, which knowledge they forget as they age, is not a Christian idea. That's a pagan idea. There is no pool of wise spirits waiting somewhere off in the ether to be assigned to human bodies. No, people don't exist in body or in spirit until they're knitted together in their mother's wombs. According to Psalm 139, 13 through 14, we are fearfully and wonderfully made and knitted together in our mother's wombs. And according to Zechariah 12:1, in that process, the Lord forms the spirit of a man within him. Moreover, it ought to be patently obvious to anyone who reads John 3:1 through 8 carefully that no one could possibly learn the language of God by listening to the children of Adam speak to one another. Because according to Jesus, you can't possibly learn the language of one kind of creature by listening to the words of a completely different kind of creature. Or to put it another way, the children of this world speak a different language from that of the children of light because they are of a different genus. Now, I don't want to get too far afield here, but that's the foundational reality underlying the parable of the sheep and the goats. Remember, that parable starts with the shepherd separating the sheep from the goats. And that separation is easy. It doesn't take any deliberation on the part of the shepherd to distinguish sheep from goats. He doesn't have to think about it or scratch his head for 1 minute to know how to distinguish between sheep and goats. And you know why that is? Because sheep are entirely different creatures, entirely different animals from goats. You can't even interbreed them, at least not naturally. No, except for possibly somewhere on the island of Dr. Moreau, you're never going to see a geep or a shoat. Sheep are ovines with 54 chromosomes. Goats are caprines with 60 chromosomes. And yes, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, the shepherd, in judging them, recites their good deeds and their bad deeds, just as the Lord does in Revelation 20, 11 through 15, where he reads out the deeds of every person as these are written in the ledger. But in Revelation 20, it isn't what's written in the ledger that determines who's thrown into the lake of fire and who isn't. No, there are two books at the judgment, the ledger and the book of life. And all those whose names are not written in the book of life are thrown into the lake of fire, no matter what is written in the ledger. So it is with the parable of the sheep and the goats. I mean, don't you ever wonder why there are no bad sheep in the parable and why there are no good goats? Because Jesus is making a point with that parable. Sheep are sheep. And when sheep, which represent the saved, do what sheep do, they don't remember doing such things, because to them, those things are unremarkable. They're normal. They're not just being humble when they say, well, when did we see you hungry and give you something to eat? No, they honestly don't remember, because to them, that kind of thing comes as naturally as breathing. They're just doing what sheep do. Sheep are sheep. And goats are goats. And when goats, which represent the lost, do what goats do, they don't remember doing those things, because to them, those things are unremarkable. They're normal. They're not being dishonest when they say, when did we see you hungry and not give you something to eat? No, they honestly don't remember, because to them, that kind of thing comes as naturally as breathing. They're just doing what goats do. Goats are goats. You all know the duck test. If it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. And you also know the story of the ugly duckling. And because you know the ending, you know why it is that the ugly duckling didn't fit in with the other ducks. Why it is that he didn't look like a duck and swim like a duck and quack like a duck. Because he wasn't a duck. He was a swan. Well, in John 3, Jesus tells Nicodemus, you think you understand those who are born of the Spirit, but you don't. And moreover, you can't, because you don't have the capacity to understand those who have been born of the Spirit, because you haven't been born of the Spirit. Thus far, you have been born only of water. As Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural person does not apprehend the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them, because they're spiritually discerned. And in Luke 16:8, Jesus tells us that The children of this world are more astute in dealing with their own kind than are the children of light. And that's a fact. The children of this world know how to work things in this world to their own advantage in a way that's simply beyond the children of light. Because just as we speak a language they don't understand, they speak a language we don't understand. But Jesus doesn't leave it at that. The purpose of this parable isn't simply to indict the children of this world. The purpose of this parable is to demonstrate to us that, in a sense, wisdom is wisdom. And if we take a close look at the behavior of those who are wise in the ways of this world, and take the time to try to understand why they do what they do, we just might learn a thing or two. Well, like what? What wisdom does the world have to offer us? What do the children of this world know that we don't know? What can we learn from watching sinners sin? Come back next week, and I'll tell you. That's my lesson for today.